The stagecoach wheels screamed against stone as Hannah Cole pressed her face to the dusty window, watching death ride hard behind them. 3 horsemen emerged from the amber wall of the sandstorm, like demons from hell, their faces masked by bandanas, rifles glinting in the dying light. The driver's whip cracked like thunder above the howling wind. "Faster!" she shouted, but her voice was lost in the chaos of splintering wood and screaming horses. The coach lurched violently to the right, throwing her against the door. Through the swirling dust, she caught glimpses of the pursuers gaining ground, their mounts fresh while her team was already lathered with foam and exhaustion. The woman's gloved hands gripped the leather seat as she studied her reflection in the cracked mirror opposite. The scars that covered the left side of her face looked convincing enough in this light, a network of carefully applied theater putty and rouge that had fooled everyone in Dust Hollow for 3 months. But the fear in her green eyes was real. Someone had found her. A bullet shattered the rear window, sending glass fragments across the coach floor. The driver cursed in Spanish, his voice strained with panic. "Señora, they're closing in." Hannah reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a Colt revolver, checking the cylinder with practiced efficiency. The motion was too smooth, too confident for a simple widowed seamstress from Kansas. She caught herself and forced her movements to become more hesitant, more frightened. Even now, even fleeing for her life, she couldn't drop the charade completely. The stagecoach hit a deep rut and went airborne for a terrifying moment before crashing down hard. The left rear wheel splintered with a sound like breaking bones, and the coach began to list dangerously. Hannah could hear the driver fighting to control the team, but physics and gravity were no longer on their side. "Jump!" the driver screamed in English. "Salta ahora!" The coach tilted further, and Hannah knew she had seconds before it would roll completely. She grabbed her bag, kicked open the door, and leaped into the storm. The ground rose up to meet her with punishing force, driving the air from her lungs and sending her tumbling through thorny scrub and sharp rocks. Behind her, the stagecoach completed its death roll with a thunderous crash of wood and metal. One of the horses screamed in pain, a sound that cut through the wind like a blade. Hannah forced herself to her feet, tasting blood, and stumbled toward where the driver had been thrown. She found him pinned beneath part of the coach, his leg bent at an impossible angle. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes were still alert. "Señora Hannah," he gasped, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "They're not bandits. They knew you'd be on this coach." Ice formed in Hannah's stomach, despite the desert heat. "What do you mean, one of them called you by another name? Not Hannah." His grip tightened, his fingernails digging into her skin. "Called you Abigail." The name hit her like a physical blow. Abigail Reed. The name she'd buried with her old life, along with the guilt and the blood money and the endless suffocating expectations of her father's empire. The name that should have died in San Francisco Bay, along with the woman who'd once worn silk gowns and attended society dinners while her father's ships carried opium and human misery across the Pacific. Thunder boomed overhead, but there were no clouds in the sky. It was the sound of approaching hoofbeats, dozens of them now. Through the shifting walls of sand, she could see more riders emerging from the storm. This wasn't a random attack by desperate men. This was an organized hunt. "D.O." the driver wheezed, releasing her wrist. "The mission, San Xavier. Find Nakai. Tell him the crows have come to roost." Before Hannah could ask what he meant, his eyes went glassy and his chest stopped moving. She knelt there for a moment, feeling the weight of another death on her conscience, then forced herself to move. The riders were close enough now that she could hear their shouts over the wind. She ran into the storm, leaving the wreckage behind her carefully constructed identity, as Hannah Cole crumbling like the fake scars on her face. The putty was beginning to peel away in the wind, revealing smooth, unblemished skin beneath. Soon, there would be nowhere left to hide. The storm swallowed her whole, and in its embrace she became neither Hannah nor Abigail, but something new, a woman with no name and no past, running toward an uncertain future through the endless, unforgiving desert. 3 hours later, when the sandstorm finally began to subside, Hannah Cole emerged from a shallow arroyo like a specter covered in dust and dried blood. The sun was a crimson disk hanging low in the western sky, painting the desert the color of old copper pennies. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and every breath was a struggle against the grit that had worked its way into her lungs. The mission bells of San Xavier del Bac rose from the wavering heat like a mirage made real. The whitewashed walls of the old Spanish church gleamed in the fading light, surrounded by a small cluster of adobe buildings that seemed to grow from the desert floor itself. Smoke rose from several chimneys, promising warmth and water and temporary sanctuary. But as she stumbled closer, Hannah noticed something wrong. The mission's massive wooden doors hung open, creaking in the wind, like a mouth gasping for breath. No lights showed in the windows, and the silence was too complete, too absolute. Even the desert had its sounds, the rustle of small creatures, the whisper of wind through sage and mesquite. Here there was nothing. She paused at the edge of the mission's yard, studying the shadows between the buildings. Her hand found the grip of her revolver, though she wasn't sure how many rounds she had left. The weight of it was comforting, solid, and real, in a world that seemed increasingly like a fever dream. "You're late." The voice came from directly behind her, though she was certain no one had been there moments before. Hannah spun around, raising the gun, and found herself staring at a man who seemed carved from the desert itself. He was tall and lean, with skin the color of burnished bronze, and eyes like chips of obsidian. His black hair was pulled back in a traditional style, and he wore a mixture of white man's clothing and tribal accessories: denim pants, a cotton shirt, and a silver concho belt that caught the last rays of sunlight. "Easy," he said, raising his hand slowly. "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be feeding the buzzards." "On Nakai?" she asked, though something in his bearing had already confirmed it. This was a man who moved like water over stone, silent and purposeful. He nodded once. "Miguel sent word you might be coming. Didn't expect you to arrive in quite such dramatic fashion." His gaze moved to the torn fabric of her dress, the scratches on her hands and face, the way she held herself, like someone expecting another attack at any moment. "The stagecoach, destroyed. Miguel's dead." She kept the gun trained on him, though something in his manner suggested he was more ally than threat. "He said to tell you the crows have come to roost." Nakai's expression didn't change, but she caught a flicker of something: anger, perhaps, or grim satisfaction. "Then Marcus Vane has finally made his move. Took him longer than I expected." The name sent another chill through her. Marcus Vane, her father's former business partner, the man who'd proposed marriage to her with all the warmth of a stock transaction. The man she'd fled San Francisco to escape, faking her own death in the process. If Vane had found her trail, then her carefully constructed new life was about to become a very short one. "How many men does he have with him?" Nakai asked, holstering a rifle she hadn't even noticed he was carrying. "I counted at least a dozen riders, maybe more in the storm." Hannah finally lowered her weapon, though she kept it ready. "They knew exactly which coach I'd be on. Someone's been feeding them information. Someone always is in a place like Dust Hollow. Gold loosens tongues faster than whiskey." He turned toward the mission, gesturing for her to follow. "Come. We need to get you cleaned up and fed before they pick up your trail again." As they walked toward the mission, Hannah found herself studying her unlikely protector. Everything about him spoke of controlled violence, held in check: the way he moved, without making a sound, the unconscious way his hand drifted toward weapons, the constant scanning of their surroundings. This was a man who'd seen war, and more than that, he'd survived it. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they reached the mission's entrance. Nakai paused with his hand on the heavy wooden door. "Because Miguel asked me to. Because Vane's men have been making life difficult for my people. And because—" He studied her face for a long moment, taking in the remnants of her fake scars, the aristocratic bone structure that no amount of theater putty could truly hide. "Because sometimes the enemy of my enemy is worth keeping alive." Inside the mission was a study in contrasts. The main chapel retained its Spanish colonial grandeur, soaring arches, ornate altarpieces, and walls covered in religious murals that seemed to glow in the candlelight. But the living quarters had been converted into something more practical, a frontier refuge, where travelers could find food, water, and protection from both the elements and human predators. An elderly Apache woman emerged from the shadows, moving with the quiet dignity of someone who'd seen many seasons pass. Her hair was silver white, braided with beads and feathers, and her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. "This is Ayana," Nakai said. "She'll help you get cleaned up while I see about those crows circling outside." Ayana approached Hannah with gentle hands, examining the cuts and bruises from her fall. She spoke softly in Apache, her voice like wind through autumn leaves, then switched to accented English. "You are hurt, child. Come." As the old woman led her toward a side chamber, Hannah glanced back at Nakai. He was standing at one of the windows, rifle in hand, watching the desert with the patience of a predator. Whatever his reasons for helping her, she was grateful. In a world where everyone seemed to want her dead, an ally, even a reluctant one, was worth more than gold. The chamber Ayana led her to was simple, but clean, a small room with a wash basin, a narrow bed, and a wooden chest containing simple clothing. The old woman began heating water over a small fire, adding herbs that filled the air with a pleasant medicinal scent. "You run from bad men," Ayana said. It wasn't a question. Hannah nodded, beginning to peel away the remnants of her disguise. The theater putty came off in chunks, revealing the unmarked skin beneath. "Very bad men. All men are bad, child. Some are just honest about it." Ayana tested the water temperature with her finger, then poured it into the basin. "Nakai, he thinks he is bad man too. But bad men, they do not protect strangers." As Hannah began to wash away the dust and blood of her ordeal, she found herself wondering about her protector's past. There was something in his eyes, a weight that spoke of old grief, old guilt. Whatever had brought him to this place, whatever had put him at odds with men like Marcus Vane, it had marked him deeply. Outside, the desert night was falling like a black curtain, bringing with it the promise of cold, and the certainty that somewhere in the darkness, her enemies were closing in. But for now, in this small sanctuary, surrounded by ancient walls and watched over by an enigmatic warrior, she was safe. It wouldn't last. It never did. But sometimes when death was riding hard behind you, temporary was enough. The attack came at dawn, as Nakai had predicted it would. Hannah woke to the sound of gunfire and Ayana's urgent whisper, "They are here, child. Time to run." Through the small window, she could see muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the pre-dawn gloom. Vane's men had surrounded the mission, and they weren't bothering with subtlety. Bullets chipped chunks from the adobe walls, and she could hear the distinctive crack of a rifle sending shots through the wooden shutters. Nakai appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Back entrance, now." They moved through the mission like ghosts, Ayana leading them through passages that seemed to exist between the walls themselves. The old woman knew every stone of this place, every hiding spot and secret way that generations of refugees had used to escape danger. But as they reached the rear courtyard, Hannah saw their escape route blocked. 3 of Vane's men waited in the shadows, guns-drawn smiles gleaming in the growing light. The largest of them, a scarred giant with dead eyes, stepped forward. Well, well. The little bird finally shows her true feathers. His voice was like gravel grinding against rusted iron. "Mr. Vane's gonna be real pleased when we bring you home, Miss Reed." The name hung in the air like a curse. Hannah felt Nakai tense beside her, his hand moving toward his knife. But 3 against 2 were poor odds, especially with Ayanna to protect. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hannah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "My name is Hannah Cole." The giant laughed. "Save it for someone who cares, princess. We got word from your friend Tessa yesterday. Real grateful she was for the gold we paid her. Told us all about your little masquerade." The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. Tessa, the young woman she'd befriended in Dust Hollow, the only person who'd shown her kindness when the townsfolk shunned her scarred face. Tessa had been the one to suggest the route through San Xavier, claiming it was safer than the main roads. She'd been betrayed by the only friend she'd made in months of running. "Take out the old woman and the Indian," the giant continued. "Vane just wants the girl alive. Preferably unmarked, but conscious ain't a requirement." That's when Nakai moved. He flowed forward like water finding its level, the knife appearing in his hand, as if by magic. The first gunman managed to fire, once the bullet going wide before Nakai's blade found his throat. The second man swung his rifle around, but Ayanna proved that age hadn't dulled her instincts. A thrown pottery jar caught him in the temple, dropping him like a stone. The giant proved more dangerous. His first shot caught Nakai in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his knife skittering across the courtyard stones. But as the man advanced for a killing shot, Hannah found her voice and her father's training. Samuel Reed had insisted his daughter know how to defend herself, even if society thought it unseemly. The Colt felt familiar in her hand as she brought it up, sighting along the barrel with practiced ease. The giant had time to register surprise before her bullet took him center mass, dropping him like a felled tree. Silence fell over the courtyard, broken only by Nakai's labored breathing and the distant sound of more riders approaching. Hannah knelt beside her wounded protector, examining the bloody hole in his shoulder. "Bad?" he asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live, but we need to move." She helped him to his feet, surprised by how solid he felt despite the wound. "How many more do you think Vane brought?" "Too many." Nakai tested his injured arm, wincing. "There's a box canyon about 2 miles north. Defensible position if we can reach it." Ayanna pressed a leather pouch into Hannah's hand. "Water and jerky. Canyon has a spring, but getting there?" She shook her head. Desert is not forgiving to wounded prey. They slipped out of the mission as the eastern sky began to blush with approaching sunrise. Behind them, Vane's men were regrouping, their shouts growing more organized, more methodical. These weren't common bandits looking for easy money. They were professionals, and they wouldn't give up easily. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of sand and stone, painted in shades of gold and rust by the early light. In the distance, the mountains rose like the backbone of some sleeping giant, their peaks touched with snow that seemed impossibly distant in the growing heat. As they climbed into the saddle of one of the mission's horses, Nakai insisting he could still ride despite his wound, Hannah found herself thinking about Tessa. The girl had seemed so genuine, so concerned about Hannah's welfare. Had it all been an act, or had desperation driven her to betrayal? Either way, it didn't matter now. Trust was a luxury Hannah could no longer afford. In this harsh land, survival meant depending only on yourself, and perhaps on the enigmatic warrior bleeding beside her, whose own reasons for helping remained as mysterious as the desert itself. Behind them, dust clouds marked their pursuers' approach. Ahead lay the promise of temporary sanctuary, if they could reach it alive. Between them stretched miles of merciless terrain, where a single mistake could mean death. Hannah Cole, or Abigail Reed, or whoever she was becoming, spurred her horse forward and embraced the chase. Sometimes running was the only way to discover what you were truly made of. The box canyon that Nakai led them to was a fortress carved by wind and water from living rock. Its walls rose nearly vertical for 100 feet, creating a natural funnel with only one way in or out. A thin stream trickled down the far wall, pooling in a basin that promised fresh water if they could hold the position long enough to reach it. But as they rode deeper into the canyon, Hannah realized they weren't the first to seek shelter here. Smoke from a small fire drifted up from behind a cluster of boulders, and she could see horses tethered in the shade of an overhanging ledge. Someone else had claimed this sanctuary first. Nakai raised a hand, bringing their small party to a halt. His dark eyes scanned the rocks above, looking for signs of an ambush. "Hello, the camp?" He called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Well, I'll be damned." A familiar voice drifted back, and Hannah's blood turned to ice. "If it ain't the famous Nakai himself, bleeding all over my hideout." A figure emerged from behind the rocks, a woman in her 30s dressed in men's clothing, with a gun belt slung low on her hips. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and her face bore the kind of weathered beauty that came from years under the harsh frontier sun. But it was her eyes that made Hannah's heart sink. Those were the eyes of someone who'd made a devil's bargain and lived to regret it. "Hello, Tessa," Hannah said quietly. Tessa's smile was sharp as a blade. "Hello yourself, Abigail. Or do you still prefer Hannah Hard to keep track of all your names?" She stepped closer, and Hannah could see the tension in her movements, the coiled readiness of someone expecting violence. "You're looking a little worse for wear. Desert travel not agreeing with you. Why?" The word came out before Hannah could stop it. "In Dust Hollow we were friends." "Friends." Tessa laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Honey, you wouldn't know a real friend if one bit you on the ass. You think batting your eyelashes and playing the tragic widow makes up for what your family did." Hannah felt Nakai shift beside her, his hand moving toward his weapon despite his wounded shoulder. But Tessa was faster, her Colt clearing leather with practiced ease. "Easy there, Chief. No need for anyone else to bleed today. Mr. Vane's paying good money for Miss Reed here, and I intend to collect." She gestured with the gun barrel. "Though, I got to admit, I'm curious about your part in all this. What's a Navajo warrior want with San Francisco royalty? And that's between me and her." Nakai said, his voice carefully neutral. "Is it now?" Tessa's eyes glittered with malicious curiosity. "Or maybe it's between you and her daddy. Word is Samuel Reed had all kinds of business partners before he took that long walk off the short pier. Some of them even had names that sound suspiciously like yours." Hannah felt, rather than saw, Nakai's reaction, a slight stiffening, a catch in his breathing that suggested Tessa had hit close to home. But whatever connection he might have had to her father, this wasn't the time to explore it. "What do you want, Tessa?" she asked. "What I want and what I'm going to get are two different things, Princess. What I want is to see you pay for what your daddy did to my family. What I'm going to get is enough gold to buy myself a new life somewhere far from here." She gestured toward the canyon entrance. "Vane's boys will be along shortly. I sent word with a mirror signal soon as I saw you coming." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching riders echoed off the canyon walls. Too many riders, judging by the volume. Hannah counted hoofbeats and came up with at least 8 horses, probably more. "Last chance," Tessa said, raising her voice as the riders drew nearer. "Surrender now, and maybe Vane'll make it quick. Try to run, and I guarantee it won't be pleasant." Hannah exchanged a look with Nakai. His dark eyes held a question, and she found herself nodding slightly. Whatever his connection to her father, whatever secrets he was keeping, he'd bled for her. That counted for something in this harsh land. "Afraid I can't do that," Hannah said, her hand drifting toward her gun. What happened next unfolded with the deadly precision of a desert thunderstorm. Nakai rolled from his saddle as Tessa's attention focused on Hannah, his wounded arm forgotten in the need for survival. Hannah threw herself sideways, drawing her Colt as she hit the ground. Tessa's first shot went wide, sparking off stone where Hannah's head had been a split second before. The confined space of the canyon turned the gunfight into a nightmare of ricochets and echoes. Hannah rolled behind a boulder as bullets chipped stone around her, feeling fragments sting her cheek. She could hear Nakai moving somewhere to her left, but couldn't see him through the gun smoke that was beginning to fill the narrow space. Then the real trouble arrived. Vane's riders poured into the canyon like a flash flood, their weapons already drawn. Hannah counted 9 men, all of them professionals by the look of their equipment and the way they moved. At their head rode a figure she recognized, even through the haze of cordite and dust. Marcus Vane sat his horse like a man born to command. He was tall and lean, with silver-touched hair and the kind of aristocratic features that had made him welcome in San Francisco's finest drawing rooms. But there was something cold in his pale blue eyes, something that spoke of depths better left unexplored. Miss Reed. He called out, his cultured voice carrying easily over the gunfire. How lovely to see you again. You're looking remarkably well for a woman who's supposed to be dead. Hannah didn't answer, focusing instead on reloading her weapon behind the dubious cover of her boulder. She had maybe a dozen shots left, plus whatever ammunition Nakai was carrying. Against 9 professional gunmen and a vindictive former friend, their chances were somewhere between slim and non-existent. Come now, my dear. Vane continued, dismounting with casual grace. Surely we can discuss this like civilized people. I have a proposition that might interest you. The only thing I'm interested in is seeing you dead. Hannah called back. Vane's laughter was like ice cracking. Such passion, your father had the same fire, you know. Right up until the moment I put a bullet in his head. The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. Her father's death had been ruled a suicide, Samuel Reed driven to despair by financial ruin and scandal, taking his own life rather than face disgrace. But if Vane was telling the truth, that's right, my dear. Poor Samuel didn't jump from that pier. He was pushed. After signing over his shipping interests to me, of course. Amazing how cooperative a man becomes when you threaten his daughter's life. Vane's voice grew closer, and Hannah realized he was advancing under cover of his men's guns. Unfortunately, you proved rather more resourceful than anticipated. Faking your own death was quite clever, I must admit. Through the chaos of the gunfight, Hannah caught sight of Nakai. He'd worked his way around to the side of the canyon, using the rocks for cover. There was something in his hand, not a gun, but what looked like a stick of dynamite. Where had he gotten that? Their eyes met across the battlefield, and he held up 3 fingers. Then 2. Then 1. Hannah threw herself flat as the explosion tore through the canyon like the wrath of an angry god. Rock dust filled the air, and the concussion left her ears ringing. When the dust cleared, she saw that Nakai's charge had brought down part of the canyon wall, creating a barrier between them and most of Vane's men. But it had also trapped them deeper in the canyon, with only one way out through their enemies. Impressive, Vane called out from behind the rockfall. But ultimately futile. You're trapped, Miss Reed, and I have all the time in the world. Hannah looked around their improvised fortress. The pool of fresh water gleamed temptingly in the afternoon light, and the high walls provided excellent defensive positions. They could hold out for a while, certainly longer than she'd expected when this all began. But Vane was right. They were trapped, and eventually water and ammunition would run out, unless she studied the canyon walls more carefully, noting the way the ancient water had carved channels in the stone. There, about 30 feet up the eastern wall, was what might be a ledge. And beyond that, the faint suggestion of a crack that could be another passage. It would be a desperate climb, especially with Nakai wounded. But it might be their only chance. As if reading her thoughts, Nakai appeared beside her, his dark eyes following her gaze upward. "Can you climb?" he asked quietly. Hannah thought of all the things she'd learned to do since leaving San Francisco, shooting, riding, lying with conviction. Adding rock climbing to the list shouldn't be that difficult. I can learn, she said. Nakai almost smiled. Then we wait for dark. Night fell over the canyon like a velvet curtain, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep from the very stones. Hannah had spent the daylight hours watching their enemies, learning their patterns, counting their numbers. Vane had 9 men, not including Tessa, who seemed to have taken on the role of his lieutenant with uncomfortable enthusiasm. They'd made camp at the canyon mouth, building fires that would both warm them and prevent any escape attempts. Or so they thought. What they hadn't counted on was the kind of desperate ingenuity that came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Nakai had used the afternoon to tend his wound and study the canyon walls. His knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic. He knew which rocks would hold weight, which cracks were deep enough to provide handholds, which roots offered the best cover from watching eyes below. My grandfather hunted in these canyons, he'd told her during one of their brief planning sessions. He taught me that stone remembers everything, where the water runs, where the wind blows, where a man can hide from his enemies. Now, as the moon climbed toward its zenith, it was time to test that ancient wisdom. They began their ascent in complete silence, using handholds that seemed impossible, until Nakai showed her how to read the rock face like a map. His wounded shoulder clearly pained him, but he moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned climbing before he'd learned to walk. Hannah followed her fingers growing numb from the cold stone, her muscles aching from the unaccustomed strain. Below them, Vane's sentries maintained their watch, but their attention was focused on the obvious escape routes, the canyon floor and the main entrance. They weren't looking up. Halfway to the ledge, disaster nearly struck. Hannah's foot slipped on a patch of loose scree, sending pebbles rattling down the cliff face. She froze, hanging by her fingertips, certain that the sound would bring their enemies running. But Nakai had chosen their route well. The wind that constantly swept through the canyon carried away the small sounds of their passage, masking them in its eternal whisper. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they reached the ledge. The crack in the rock wall was real, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but leading to somewhere. Nakai went first, his lean frame disappearing into the stone like a ghost returning to its rest. Hannah followed, fighting down claustrophobia as the walls pressed in around her. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening into small chambers, sometimes narrowing to gaps that required them to crawl on hands and knees. But it was leading upward, and that was what mattered. Eventually, it had to emerge somewhere. When they finally reached the surface, Hannah was surprised to find herself on a mesa overlooking the canyon. The fires of their enemies glowed far below, like fallen stars, and she could hear the faint sound of voices carried on the night wind. "Now what?" she asked, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. Nakai was studying the landscape with the intensity of a hawk searching for prey. "Now we become the hunters instead of the hunted." He led her to where he'd hidden supplies during their afternoon reconnaissance, water, ammunition, and something that made Hannah's eyes widen in surprise. It was a small case containing what looked like military explosives, complete with fuses and detonators. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Your father wasn't the only one who did business with questionable partners." Nakai said, his voice carefully neutral. "Sometimes those partnerships leave useful resources scattered around the desert." There was more to that story, Hannah was certain. But this wasn't the time for interrogations. If Nakai wanted to keep his secrets, that was his choice. She had enough mysteries of her own to worry about. They spent the next hour carefully positioning charges around the rim of the canyon. Not enough to bring down the walls that would kill everyone, including any innocents Vane might have pressed into service, but enough to block the main entrance and trap their enemies in the same box they'd tried to create for their prey. As they worked, Hannah found herself thinking about Tessa. Despite the betrayal, despite the very real possibility that her former friend would try to kill her before this was over, she couldn't quite bring herself to hate the young woman. There had been genuine pain in Tessa's eyes when she'd spoken of Hannah's family. Whatever Samuel Reed had done, it had left scars that went deeper than flesh. "Ready?" Nakai asked, holding the detonator in his good hand. Hannah took one last look at the fires below. Somewhere down there, Marcus Vane was probably sleeping peacefully, confident that his trap was secure. In a few moments, he was going to get a very rude awakening. "Do it," she said. The explosion lit up the night like a second sunrise. Rock tumbled into the canyon mouth with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Shouts of alarm drifted up from below, followed by the sound of panicked horses and men scrambling for weapons. But the trap was sprung. Vane and his men were now the ones with no way out. "Phase 2, Nakai said, shouldering his rifle. They made their way down the outer face of the mesa, using a game trail that was invisible from the canyon floor. By the time they reached ground level, Vane's men were beginning to organize themselves, but the confusion of the rock fall had given the hunted a crucial advantage. Hannah settled into position behind a cluster of boulders, with a clear view of the canyon entrance, or what was left of it. Nakai took up position on the opposite side, creating a crossfire that would make any escape attempt extremely hazardous. "Meh." Hannah called out, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Let's talk." There was a long silence before his cultured voice drifted back. "I must congratulate you, Miss Reed. Most impressive. But surely you realize this solves nothing? My men will clear that rock fall eventually, and when they do, they'll find the territorial marshal waiting for them." Hannah lied smoothly. Amazing how interested law enforcement becomes when you tell them about murder and kidnapping. Another silence, longer this time. When Vane spoke again, his voice had lost some of its confident edge. "What do you want?" "The truth. About my father. About why you've been hunting me across half the territory." Hannah kept her rifle trained on the canyon mouth, ready for any sign of movement. "And about what you really did with his shipping business." "The truth." Vane's laughter was bitter. "Very well. Your father was a fool who stumbled onto something far larger than his small mind could comprehend. The opium trade was just the beginning, a way to finance operations that would reshape the entire Pacific. When he developed a conscience, he became a liability. What operations? Arms shipments to revolutionary factions in Mexico. Gold to buy political influence in Washington. The kind of long-term thinking that your father never possessed." Vane's voice was growing closer, and Hannah tensed. He wanted to pull out to cleanse his soul, or some such nonsense. As if the blood money he'd already taken could be washed clean with good intentions. Hannah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Her father's increasing isolation in his final months. The strange visitors who came to their house at odd hours. The way he'd looked at her sometimes, as if seeing a ghost. "So you killed him," she said. "I did what was necessary. Just as I'm doing now." Vane's voice was very close now, and Hannah caught a flicker of movement in the shadows near the rock fall. "Your death will close the last loose end. After that, no one will be left who knows enough to cause problems." That's when Tessa stepped into the open gun, drawn, her face pale in the moonlight. But she wasn't aiming at Hannah. She was aiming at the rocks where Vane was hiding. "Except me," she said quietly. "I know enough, Marcus. I know everything." The standoff stretched across the canyon floor like a spider's web of mutual betrayal. Tessa stood in the open, her gun trained on Vane's position, while Hannah kept her rifle aimed at the same cluster of rocks. Somewhere in the shadows, Nakai waited with the patience of stone, ready to strike when the moment came. "Tessa." Vane's voice carried a note of fatherly disappointment. "What are you doing, my dear?" "What I should have done months ago." Tessa's hand was steady, but Hannah could see the tension in her shoulders. "I know what you did to my family, Marcus. I know it wasn't Samuel Reed who ordered that fire." Hannah felt the world shift slightly on its axis. What fire? The warehouse fire in San Francisco. 3 years ago. Tessa's eyes never left Vane's hiding place, but her words were clearly meant for Hannah. My father worked for Reed Shipping. He was an accountant, and he found discrepancies in the books. Money that should have been going to legitimate cargo was being diverted. Tessa, please. Vane's voice carried a warning now. You don't understand the complexities. I understand that you burned down the warehouse with my parents inside. Tessa's composure finally cracked, and Hannah could hear tears in her voice. I understand that you let Samuel Reed take the blame while you covered your tracks. More pieces fell into place. Hannah remembered the warehouse fire. It had been front-page news for weeks. 3 dead, including a longtime Reed Shipping employee and his wife. Her father had been devastated, claiming the fire was his fault for not maintaining proper safety protocols. But if Tessa was telling the truth, my father blamed himself for their deaths. Hannah said slowly. He never got over it. The guilt ate at him until he became inconvenient. Vane finished stepping into the open with his hands raised. He was smiling, but there was nothing pleasant about the expression. Really, ladies, this is all very touching but ultimately pointless. The past is dead. It's the future that concerns me now. Hannah studied the man who'd haunted her nightmares for months. In the moonlight, he looked older than she remembered, his aristocratic features sharpened by years of calculated cruelty. But there was something else in his bearing, a confidence that suggested he wasn't as trapped as he appeared. Where are your men, Marcus? She asked. Ah, you noticed. His smile widened. Did you really think a little rock fall would contain professionals? They've been working their way out through the back passages for the past hour. Should be in position any moment now. As if summoned by his words, the sound of boots on stone echoed from multiple directions. Vane's men had indeed found another way out of the canyon, and now they were closing in from all sides. Hannah counted at least 6 different positions, probably more. Last chance. Vane said, lowering his hands. Surrender now, and I promise to make it quick. Continue this charade, and I'll let my men have their fun before the killing starts. Hannah looked at Tessa, seeing her own desperation reflected in the younger woman's eyes. They'd been outmaneuvered by a master manipulator, trapped just as surely as they'd trapped their enemies. The only difference was that Vane's trap had steel teeth. That's when Nakai made his move. The Apache warrior seemed to materialize from the shadows, like smoke given form. His knife found the throat of the nearest gunman before anyone realized he'd moved. By the time Vane's other men began firing, Nakai had already claimed 2 more victims and disappeared back into the darkness. The canyon erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning, and the sound of gunfire echoed off the walls in a deafening cacophony. Hannah threw herself behind cover, dragging Tessa with her as bullets chipped stone around their position. This way. Nakai's voice came from somewhere to their left. The spring. They ran through the maze of boulders and shadows, following the sound of trickling water that had drawn them to this place. Behind them, Vane was shouting orders to his men, his cultured facade finally cracking under pressure. The spring emerged from a crack in the canyon wall, creating a small pool before disappearing again into the stone. But more importantly, the water had carved a narrow channel that led deeper into the rock face. It was barely wide enough for a person, but it offered the possibility of escape. "Can you swim?" Nakai asked, testing the water's depth with his rifle barrel. Well enough," Hannah replied, though the idea of squeezing through an underwater passage in complete darkness made her stomach clench with fear. "I can't," Tessa said quietly. "Never learned." Hannah looked at the woman who'd betrayed her, who'd caused untold suffering with her thirst for revenge, who'd just saved her life by turning on Marcus Vane. In that moment, the choice was surprisingly easy. "Then we go together," she said, grabbing Tessa's hand. "Hold your breath." They plunged into the icy water, just as Vane's men rounded the rocks behind them. The current was stronger than Hannah had expected, pulling them into the narrow channel with irresistible force. She held tightly to Tessa's hand as they were swept into darkness, her lungs already beginning to burn from held breath. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening into air pockets, where they could gasp a few precious breaths, sometimes narrowing to gaps that scraped skin from their shoulders. Hannah lost track of time, lost track of direction, lost track of everything except the need to keep moving forward. When they finally emerged into moonlight, gasping and shivering, they found themselves in a pool nearly a mile from the canyon. Nakai was already waiting on the bank, his dark eyes reflecting relief that he quickly hid behind his usual stoic mask. "Vane?" Hannah asked when she could speak again. Lost in the passage. The current took him under. Nakai helped them out of the water, his movements careful of his wounded shoulder. "His men are still searching the canyon. It'll be dawn before they realize we've escaped." Hannah sank onto a rock, suddenly feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The chase, the betrayals, the revelations about her father's death, it all seemed like something from a fever dream. But the cold water dripping from her clothes and the ache in her lungs proved it was all too real. "What now?" Tessa asked. She looked smaller, somehow diminished by her ordeal, and the knowledge that her quest for revenge had led to more death. "Now we disappear," Hannah said. "All of us. Vane's operation was bigger than just him. There will be others who want us dead." Nakai nodded. "My people know places where the white man's law can't reach. Safe places." And then, Tessa's voice was barely above a whisper. Hannah looked at the woman who'd been her enemy and her ally in the span of a few hours. There would be time later to work through the complex emotions of betrayal and forgiveness. For now, survival was enough. "Then we figure out how to live with what we've done," she said. "And maybe if we're lucky, we learn how to build something better from the ashes." The desert stretched around them in all directions, vast and unforgiving. But for the first time since fleeing San Francisco, Hannah didn't feel like she was running from something. She was running toward whatever came next, and that made all the difference. 6 months later, the settlement that would eventually be known as Havens Creek was little more than a cluster of adobe buildings and canvas tents scattered along a seasonal stream. But to the 3 people who'd founded it, the small community represented something far more valuable than gold or glory. It represented hope. Hannah stood on the porch of what served as the settlement's general store, watching Nakai work with a group of Apache children. He was teaching them to read English, while they taught him words in their own language, a cultural exchange that would have been impossible in the rigid hierarchies of civilization. The man she'd once known as the silent, dangerous warrior had revealed depths she'd never suspected. His knowledge of engineering had helped them design irrigation channels that brought life to the desert. His connections with various tribal groups had created a network of allies and trading partners. Most importantly, his unwavering moral compass had helped guide their small community through the inevitable conflicts that arose when desperate people tried to build something together. "He's good with them," Tessa said, emerging from the store with a ledger tucked under her arm. The younger woman had appointed herself the settlement's bookkeeper, bringing the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made her such an effective spy. "He's good with everyone," Hannah replied. "I've never seen him lose his temper, not even when the Rodriguez brothers got into that fight over the water rights." Tessa settled into the chair beside her, opening the ledger to review the day's transactions. Their relationship had evolved into something that wasn't quite friendship, but wasn't mere alliance either. The shared trauma of their escape had created a bond that transcended their complicated history. "Speaking of water rights," Tessa said, "we're going to need to expand the irrigation system again. The Pima delegation is bringing 3 more families next month." Hannah nodded, making a mental note to discuss the expansion with Nakai. Their settlement had become something of a sanctuary for displaced people, Apache fleeing the reservation system, Mexican families escaping violence along the border, whites who'd fallen afoul of the law or simply wanted to disappear. It was a delicate balance keeping such diverse groups working together, but somehow they'd managed it. "Any word from the territorial governor's office?" Hannah asked. "Still nothing official. But my contact in Tucson says they're less interested in our legal status than in whether we're causing problems for the larger settlements." Tessa made a note in the margin of her ledger. "As long as we keep to ourselves and don't give them a reason to intervene, they seem content to pretend we don't exist." It was a precarious existence, building a community outside the formal boundaries of law and civilization. But it was also liberating in ways Hannah was still discovering. Here, no one cared about her father's crimes or her own fictional past. What mattered was whether you could contribute to the common good, whether you could be trusted when times got hard. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. A small group of riders was cresting the hill that marked the eastern boundary of their valley, moving at the steady pace of people who weren't fleeing anything, but had specific business to conduct. Nakai rose from his teaching circle, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. 3 riders, he called out. White men well armed but not looking for trouble. Hannah felt the familiar tension that always accompanied unexpected visitors. Despite their isolated location, they occasionally attracted attention from the outside world, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. The key was determining which category these visitors fell into before they got close enough to cause problems. As the riders drew nearer, Hannah recognized the lead figure. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. More importantly, he wore the badge of a U.S. Marshal. "Marshal Garrett," Hannah said as the man dismounted near the porch. "What brings you to our little community?" James Garrett had visited them twice before, ostensibly to investigate reports of irregular activity in the valley. But Hannah suspected his real purpose had more to do with curiosity than law enforcement. He seemed genuinely interested in what they were trying to build here. "Official business, I'm afraid," Garrett replied, but his tone was more apologetic than threatening. "I've got warrants I'm supposed to serve. Federal warrants." Hannah felt her stomach drop. After 6 months of peace, had their past finally caught up with them? "Well, what kind of warrants?" Nakai asked, moving to stand beside Hannah. His hand wasn't near his weapon, but his posture suggested readiness for anything. Garrett reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a bundle of official-looking documents. "Murder warrants for Marcus Vane and 8 of his associates." He looked directly at Hannah. "Seems someone in San Francisco finally got around to investigating those warehouse fires and some other irregularities. Found enough evidence to convince a federal judge that Mr. Vane was responsible for multiple deaths." Hannah exchanged glances with Nakai and Tessa. This was news they hadn't expected. "The interesting thing," Garrett continued, "is that most of the evidence came from documents that were anonymously delivered to the authorities. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements, all pointing to a conspiracy that went much deeper than anyone suspected." Tessa cleared her throat. "Hypothetically speaking, Marshal, what would happen to someone who might have been involved in delivering such evidence?" Garrett's smile was knowing. "Hypothetically, the federal prosecutor is so grateful for the assistance that he's not inclined to ask too many questions about how the evidence was obtained. Sometimes justice is more important than procedure." Hannah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "And the warrants?" "Can't serve warrants on dead men," Garrett said. "According to multiple witnesses, Marcus Vane and his associates died in a flash flood in the Dragoon Mountains 6 months ago. Tragic accident, really. Bodies were never recovered." The 3 of them stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. After months of looking over their shoulders, they were finally free of their past. There is one more thing, Garrett said, reaching into his pocket. This came for someone named Hannah Cole. Care to hazard a guess who that might be? He handed Hannah a letter bearing the seal of a San Francisco bank. With trembling fingers, she opened it and read the contents, her eyes widening with each line. "What is it?" Tessa asked. "It's from my father's estate attorney. Apparently, before he died, my father set up a trust fund that would only activate if certain conditions were met." Hannah looked up from the letter, hardly daring to believe what she was reading. The primary condition was that Marcus Vane be found guilty of crimes against the Reed family. "How much?" Nakai asked practically. "Enough to turn this settlement into a real town. Enough to build schools and hospitals and everything else we've been dreaming about." Hannah folded the letter carefully. Enough to prove that sometimes the dead can still fight for justice. Marshal Garrett tipped his hat. "Congratulations, Miss Cole. I hope you put it to good use." As the marshal and his men rode away, Hannah found herself thinking about her father. Samuel Reed had been many things, some good, some not so good. But in the end, he'd found a way to make amends for his mistakes. The money wouldn't bring back the dead or erase the pain his business had caused, but it could help build something better. "So what now?" Tessa asked. Hannah looked around at the small community they'd built, from nothing, the children playing in the dust, the families working together to bring life to the desert, the careful harmony between cultures that had learned to coexist. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. "Now we build," she said. "We build something worthy of second chances." The desert wind carried the sound of laughter from the teaching circle, where Nakai was showing the children how to build small dams in the stream. It was a perfect metaphor, Hannah thought. Take what the land gives you, direct it wisely, and you can make the desert bloom. 3 people who'd lost everything had found something worth fighting for. In a harsh land that offered no guarantees that was victory enough. 1 year later, Havens Creek had grown into something that resembled an actual town. The adobe buildings had been expanded and improved. The irrigation system now supported nearly 200 residents, and the school that Nakai had built was becoming famous throughout the territory for its innovative approach to multicultural education. Hannah stood in the cemetery on the hill, overlooking the town, placing fresh flowers on the grave of Miguel Santos, the stagecoach driver, whose sacrifice had saved her life and made all of this possible. It had taken months to track down his family and bring his body here for proper burial, but she'd felt it was important. Heroes deserve to be remembered. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced another visitor. Hannah turned to see Tessa approaching a small bundle in her arms. The younger woman's face glowed with the particular radiance of new motherhood. "How's little Samuel?" Hannah asked, gently touching the baby's tiny fist. "Growing like a weed and twice as demanding." Tessa replied with obvious affection. "Tom says he's got his mother's temper and his father's appetite." Tessa's marriage to Tom Rodriguez had surprised everyone, including Tessa herself. The quiet blacksmith had courted her with patient persistence, seeing past her complicated history to the woman underneath. Their wedding had been one of the first celebrations in Havens Creek, a joyous affair that had brought the entire community together. "Any regrets?" Hannah asked. Tessa considered the question seriously. "About some of the things I did every day. About ending up here with these people building this life." She shook her head. "Never." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the bustle of activity in the valley below. The town was preparing for the Harvest Festival, their first official celebration as a recognized territorial settlement. It had taken considerable political maneuvering and not a small amount of bribery, but Havens Creek was now officially on the map. "Speaking of regrets," Tessa said carefully, "have you given any more thought to Nakai's proposal?" Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. The Apache warrior's declaration of love had been as understated and practical as the man himself delivered while they were reviewing plans for the new hospital, presented as simply another fact to be considered in their ongoing partnership. "It's complicated," Hannah said. "No, it's not." Tessa shifted little Samuel to her other arm. "You love him, he loves you. And you've been through enough together to know you can count on each other when things get tough." "What's complicated about that?" Hannah looked down at the town where Nakai was currently mediating a dispute between the Apache families and the Mexican farmers over hunting rights in the Western Hills. He approached every problem with the same quiet wisdom, the same unshakable moral foundation that had guided them through their darkest moments. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of being happy. Of letting myself believe that I deserve this." Hannah gestured toward the thriving community below. "My father's money built most of this place. Blood money earned through suffering and exploitation. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just finding a more pleasant way to benefit from other people's misery." Tessa was quiet for a long moment, studying her friend's face. "You know what? I think your father would be proud of what you've done with his legacy. You've taken something poisonous and turned it into medicine." Before Hannah could respond, the sound of rapid hoofbeats drew their attention to the main road. A single rider was approaching at a full gallop, trailing dust and urgency. As he drew nearer, Hannah recognized him as one of the Pima scouts who worked with their security patrols. The rider pulled up at the base of the hill, his horse lathered with sweat. "Miss Cole, you need to come quick. There's been an accident at the mine." Hannah felt her blood turn to ice. The silver mine that had been discovered 6 months ago was the key to Havens Creek's economic independence. More importantly, Nakai was supposed to be inspecting the new support timbers today. She ran down the hill faster than dignity or safety allowed, Tessa following close behind, despite her burden. By the time they reached the mine entrance, a crowd had already gathered. Hannah pushed through the anxious faces looking for the one that mattered most. She found Nakai sitting on a supply crate, his shirt torn and his face streaked with dust and blood. But he was alive, conscious, and arguing with Dr. Martinez about whether he needed stitches for the gash on his forehead. "Now what happened?" Hannah demanded her relief, making her voice sharper than intended. "A cave-in in Tunnel 3. Nakai replied. "Caught us by surprise, but everyone got out." He gestured toward a group of miners who were being treated for various cuts and bruises. "Could have been much worse. Anyone seriously hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal," Dr. Martinez interjected. "Though I'd feel better if certain stubborn patients would let me examine them properly." Nakai submitted to the doctor's ministrations with obvious reluctance. "We'll need to shore up the entire lower level before we can resume operations. Probably looking at 2 weeks minimum." Hannah nodded, already calculating the financial impact. The mine provided employment for nearly 50 families and was their primary source of hard currency for trading with outside suppliers. 2 weeks of closure would strain their resources, but they'd survive. The important thing was that no one had been killed. As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Hannah found herself standing alone with Nakai. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her feeling oddly vulnerable. "When I heard there'd been an accident," she began, then stopped. The words seemed inadequate. Nakai looked at her with those dark, knowing eyes. "When the tunnel started to collapse, the only thing I could think about was whether I'd told you often enough that I love you." The simple honesty of the statement broke through all of Hannah's careful defenses. Here was a man who'd faced death and emerged thinking not of himself, but of her. How could she continue to doubt what they had together? "Yes," she said. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I love you too. Yes, I'm tired of being afraid of happiness." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Yes to all of it." Nakai's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, slow, warm, and absolutely radiant. "In that case, we should probably discuss the wedding arrangements." My grandmother has some very specific ideas about proper ceremonies." Hannah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'm sure she does. We'll do it right, Apache traditions and white traditions and whatever else anyone wants to include. This is a community celebration." As they walked back toward town, Nakai's arm around her shoulders, Hannah caught sight of Tessa standing on the porch of the general store. The younger woman was grinning broadly and had apparently been sharing the news because people were beginning to emerge from buildings with congratulatory smiles. It occurred to Hannah that this was what redemption looked like, not a single moment of absolution, but a gradual accumulation of choices that led away from darkness and toward light. They'd all made mistakes, all carried scars from their past lives. But here in this impossible desert town, they'd learned that the past didn't have to define the future. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Soon the desert would give way to the cold clarity of night, and tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove themselves worthy of the second chances they'd been given. But for now, walking toward the warm lights of home with the man she loved beside her, and a community of fellow survivors waiting to celebrate their happiness. Hannah Cole, or Abigail Reed, or whoever she was becoming, was content to simply be grateful for the strange alchemy that could transform blood and dust into hope and love. In the harsh arithmetic of the desert that was wealth beyond measure,